Why you suck at Total War, reason number 5. You don't micro fast enough. This is a big one, and seems to be what most people struggle with the most. Now for those who don't know, we are of course talking about micromanagement, which by definition is one's ability to control every part, however small, of an enterprise or activity. In Total War, this means how well you can control your 10, 15, 20 units on the battlefield all at once. There is no super secret technique to getting better at microing your units. More so, I believe it's just two simple things that you'll need to work on. One is the building of habits, and the other is a slight change in your perspective on Total War. But we'll get into that. First, we'll go through a few different keyboard commands to help you manage your army more effectively, as I always get asked how I did this and that with my army in a video. So let's keep it simple to start with. We all know that you can use the drag box to select your entire army quickly. But even quicker than that, you can also use Control A. This is a nice easy keyboard command as your fingers are pretty much already there. This can be very useful if you want to move your army up and your army isn't all together. Maybe you've got some hidden units off to the side somewhere, but you can move them up with the rest of your army by easily selecting them with Control A. Then if you want to move your entire army as one, hold down Alt, left click drag, and the formation will go wherever you move it. This is the best way to move your entire army all at once together. You'll very often need to rotate the army as well, so if you hold Control 2, you can rotate the army on the spot that you stopped at. And of course you can use this on smaller groups of troops, not just your entire army. These movement controls are really essential ones that you need to know in order to improve your micromanagement at Total War. However, there is a big problem that you can run into with this, in that speed is not checked when you move your formation like this. Everything has its original speed, so something that has 90 speed will still run at that speed, something that has 30 speed will still run at that speed, and you'll quickly find that parts of your army go where you don't want them to. These trolls are getting ahead, my lord is getting ahead, my flanking units have gone off. This isn't what I wanted, I'm a little bit out of control now. So how do we combat this? Well, this is where groups come in. If you select your entire army and press G, it will put them in a group. It'll either be a locked or unlocked group, dictated by the padlock symbol. If we select a locked group, it will move our army all together. No one will be able to run ahead of each other. They'll all move at the same speed. That speed is the speed of the slowest unit though, so do be aware of that. If you've got an extra slow unit in the group, it can slow the rest of them down maybe too much. So for the most part, you wouldn't want to put your entire army in one group. I'm just doing this for demonstration. And one final useful command that I get asked about a lot is how you draw your own unit path. Shift and right mouse click drag is the secret to this one, and it means you can draw the path of where you want your unit to go. Very useful for buying you some micro time. Now let's just talk about another feature of being in locked and unlocked groups. If you put your front line in a locked group, that's when the padlock is highlighted, then they gain a slightly different behaviour than when they're in an unlocked group. With a locked group, a single click on the enemy front line will start your troops moving towards them. You'll notice that your units have straight movement paths ahead of them. This means they'll move towards the enemy, and when they get close enough, they'll auto-select their targets. They'll choose them for themselves. Now this is good in a way because it reduces micromanagement a little bit, but it is very risky. As you can see here, 2 units have selected the same unit to attack. This is a bad call as it leaves a hole in my front line, so I have to redirect one of them to make sure that we're getting a nice even matchup across that front line. So it's there if you want it, but personally I wouldn't recommend using it as it can create more problems than it's worth. It's not that difficult to just issue individual orders. And to demonstrate the difference in the attack orders with an unlocked group, which is when the padlock isn't highlighted, well, instead of moving up and auto choosing their own targets, they'll function like any other single unit and will all attack the same target, which of course is not really what we want. It's also worth noting that an unlocked group doesn't all move at the same speed like a locked group does. However, an unlocked group does give you a bit more freedom on how you spread out and deploy those troops in that group. I do have an army movement guide on all these controls and a bunch more, so do check that out at the end of the video if you so wish. So try to get yourself into the habit of using these commands if you don't already, as they really are the key to moving your army around effectively, which is the first step towards decent micromanagement. Now let's take a look at groups a bit more and some of the ways you can manage your forces. So you've deployed your army and you're ready to absolutely slaughter your foes, but we need some kind of order here. Well, a good simple way to manage your troops is to simply put them in centre, left wing, right wing. So the centre is group 1, which will be in a locked group, the left flank is group 2 and the right flank group 3. You may be best off having the flanking groups unlocked so you don't get any weird attack commands that come from that auto attack order. You can then use the number keys to quickly switch between these groups as and when you need them. The maximum amount of groups to really have is probably 4 or 5 because these are the only numbers you can easily reach on your keyboard. It's also worth thinking about what targets the units in your groups have. For example, these squigs have a different target to the Goblin Wolf Riders, so it's unlikely I'll want to tell them all to attack the same units. So I'll take the Wolf Riders out of this group so that if I want my squigs to quickly attack somebody, I can just press 2, click on the enemy, and job done. But again, it's unlikely we'll want them all to attack in a group. I've got 2 units of Boar Boys here, but there's a good chance I want to break them up and have them chasing down different targets. I find that this kind of grouping is mostly useful just for the pre-battle and start of the main battle. Another approach is to put your most important units at your fingertips. For example, your Lord is someone you might need to find quickly, as well as your Caster. So having them as some of your nearest hotkeys means you can easily and quickly cast spells or get your Lord out of a tight spot if need be. It's pretty much about finding your most important micro-intensive units and being able to control them quickly and often. So this could be flanking units like cavalry, or units that your army really revolves around. Just having them there that little bit sooner at your fingertips on the number keys is often quicker than using your eyes to look for them and then your mouse to select them, as you don't really need to micro your front line too much once they've engaged until the late game. But you can have them in a group for quick selection if you need them, or just to move up all at the same speed. So you can have your most important units on the 1, 2, 3, 4, and that saves you having to look for and then click on all these units that you want. So that's a couple of ways and ideas on how you can do it. Here's my personal preference. I have my main center army as group 1 in a locked group, and then I'm going to put my Lord on number 2 and my Caster on number 3, as I find 2 and 3 easier to reach than 1. And I try to do this in every army, in every faction that I play. Lord on 2, Caster on 3. I personally like to leave my flanking units ungrouped, as I find they always need to be very versatile, and I rarely use them all together as a group anyway. They usually split off and do different things. So these are a few different ways that you can use groups. If you watch any of the top players, they all kind of have their own way of doing things, and everyone kind of figures it out for themselves, what they like and how their brain works and what's the best for them. So experiment with it, see what works for you. My way is quite simple. I tend to rely more on quick mouse movements than I do on using the groups, because getting the habit of using the groups is something I haven't really worked on and thus don't have yet. And that's half the battle of this, is building those habits to use the groups. Even the top players of this game make their groups and they use them a lot of the time, but sometimes they just forget and just mouse drag select things anyway. So having a lot of groups isn't the only way to play, as you will see a lot of people play that way. And armies need to be so versatile in Total War, it's rare that groups can always stay together and act as a group anyway. And then you have the habit side of things, which only really comes from repetition of doing the same thing over and over again. If your army is composed of different groups with different units in it doing different things every time, it's difficult to remember which group to use when in every single battle. So personally for me, I find using just mouse dragging and selecting things individually is a better way to micro. For me. I'd say my micro is pretty good, but certainly not as good as some people's, but I've found what works for me. So, we understand the controls, you know how to group your units and move your army around, you understand that you're building habits with groups, which if you remember at the start I said there were 2 main points, habits was one of them. So let's move on to the second point now, which is your perspective on how you approach playing Total War. And it all comes down to one key attribute, the difference between good and not so good players of Total War. It's the speed of which you do things. It seems obvious, right? It's right up there at the top of the screen. You don't micro fast enough. You're too slow. But I don't think that comes from people's inability to move a mouse fast enough, because we can all move a mouse the same speed. I think the problem is that people approach Total War like it's a slow-paced game. The armies move slowly, the units take a long time to kill each other. It's not a game where we need to think and act quickly. But oh my friends, oh yes it is. Total War requires quick reflexes and quick reactions, just like most other games you probably play. Think about it, if you play a fast-paced shooter, how do you play that game? Do you walk around the corner and then slowly move your cursor over the enemy and then slowly pull the trigger? No, of course you don't. That would get you killed in a fast-paced shooter. You urgently move your mouse to the target and pull the trigger as quickly as possible. Take this same mentality to Total War. That same sense of urgency that you have when you play an FPS. So to aid that, here's a few things you can do as exercises. So we all know about dragging the mouse to select units. Well, try doing this super quickly. It only takes a fraction of a second to select a unit with a mouse by just dragging a small box around them. Whether it's 1, 2 or 10 units, it can be done very quickly. practice that little movement, it's just a flick of the wrist, and you can quickly select any unit anywhere on the battlefield, quickly and efficiently. Next time you play Total War, try it. As an exercise, in the deployment zone or whatever, try selecting a unit with a quick flick of the wrist selection, and then left click the ground around to deselect them. Just select different parts of your army as quickly as you can, and get used to that quick flick motion. As a bigger exercise, you can do something like I'm doing here. Just a small front line with a couple of flanking units. I'm just going to practice micromanaging them and selecting them as quickly as possible, and then more importantly, giving them their orders as quick as possible. This is where a lot of people slip up. They take too long making decisions. It shouldn't take any more than 1 or 2 seconds to decide what you want to do with a unit, maybe 3 at the most. And while making these decisions quickly does rely heavily on knowing your units and know what engagements are good and bad, pretty much every single engagement of any 2 units in this game comes down to one simple question. Should I engage or should I retreat? Do you need to pull away from a fight, or do you need to get stuck into that fight? That's all you do. You quickly select the unit, you move it to a position where you can set yourself up to get a good matchup, and then you wait for the opportunity to attempt to get that matchup. If that matchup comes along, you engage. If something that's not favourable to you comes along, you retreat. Like here on the right, there's some spears going after my Doomwheel and Rat Ogres, so I'm just going to pull them away from it. No need to engage in that bad matchup. I can wait for the opportunity for a good one. So that's the most basic way to think about it when you're trying to make those quick decisions. Select your unit, choose what you want to do with it quickly, and move on to the next one. Don't watch what happens, don't enjoy the charge, don't even admire the units. That's one of the big downfalls. People sit around admiring the units, which I understand, it's a beautiful game, but that's not going to help us win. If you want to admire the units, save your replays and watch them back afterwards. So, practice moving your mouse quickly and think of it like you would an FPS. You don't take your time, you do everything in a hurry with quick reactions. Try out this little exercise to get some practice just doing it with a small army. Until you feel comfortable with it, you can graduate to a full-sized army. And again, those habits are going to come into play. You need to get yourself into the habit of doing everything quickly so that you do it all the time. It's going to take some practice, and I'm not saying it's easy, but that's what's necessary. One way you can decrease your micromanagement load is to not bring complicated armies, and this is something that even the best players do sometimes. If you bring a complex army with loads of different kinds of units, you've got a lot of matchups to think about, a lot of strengths and weaknesses you have to watch out for, to utilise, and a general big increase to your micromanagement. So to combat that, you just bring simple armies of only 4 or 5 different kinds of units, then you don't have so many matchups to worry about, not so many things to micro so quickly. It just takes the load off a little bit for those of you who struggle with micromanagement. Or even those who don't struggle with it. It's a legit tactic to bring simpler builds, for that reason to decrease micro and make you play better. Both ways of playing, whether complex or simple, have their strengths and weaknesses. And finally, just a couple of extra little things that could aid your micromanagement skills. Firstly, try not to zoom in too much. The closer you are to the action, the harder it is to see everything that's going on. So the more you can stay zoomed out, the more you'll be able to see. You can try playing with different angles. If your army is particularly wide, for example, you may want to play from the side. I've even experimented with playing from behind the enemy army, as you can kind of see what they're doing, but it's a bit of a weird one. So try to zoom out, as it does give you a better view of the battlefield and everything that's going on. Another thing to think about is where you deploy and what your build is and where you need to be. I think it's a natural reaction for most people to put their army up as close to the edge of the deployment zone as possible, but there's no real need to do this. Don't be afraid to deploy nearer the back of the zone or the middle of the zone. Anywhere in the zone is fair game. The further you are from the enemy, the more time you get to think, the more time you get to see what's coming, the more time you get to micromanage. Unless you're planning a hyper-aggressive rush build, there's no need to rush. Also, be conscious of how you play. Many players don't move their army at all and they let the enemy come to them, no matter what faction they're playing. They wait for the enemy to do whatever they want to do and then they try to react to it. This kind of reactive play is often the downfall of many players, so do be aware if you play like this. Having a game plan and imposing your will on the enemy is an important part of winning battles. I'll go into this deeper in a later video, but try not to just sit there and react to whatever the enemy does. So to reiterate the main points here, get to know your controls first of all. Get it into habit that you use them. Learn how to move your army quickly and efficiently. Secondly, make good use of your groups and turn those into habit as well. Using the number keys to find your units quickly will save you those fractions of a second, which will all add up in the long run. And lastly, you've guessed it, just be quicker. Whiz your mouse around that screen like your tiny virtual men's lives depend on it. Because, well, they do. So practice all these things, turn them into habits, and there's no reason you can't be as good as anyone else. We can all move our mouse just as quick as each other. It just takes a bit of practice and knowledge, gathering all the information about all the units and knowing what works and where. It takes a lot of practice, but it can be done by anyone. You're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way, but that is absolutely fine because even the best players still make rookie mistakes from time to time. We're all human, micromanaging errors are fine and expected. Get to work on this, and there's no reason you can't stop sucking at Total War.